Top U.S. and Ukrainian representatives are arriving in Saudi Arabia for high-stakes talks, the first since that infamous Oval Office blow-up between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky. In the days since that clash, the U.S. has paused military aid and intelligence sharing with Ukraine, and Russia has ramped up its attacks. We have exclusive new reporting on what it's going to take for Trump to change his mind and restart that flow of aid and intel. NBC's Keir Simmons is live in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. NBC's Courtney Kube is at the Pentagon, and Mark Polymeropoulos is an MSNBC national security and intelligence analyst, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and former chief of operations in Europe and Eurasia. Welcome to all. So, Keir, what do we know about the agenda for these meetings?
Well, we know a limited amount, honestly. Right now, President Zelensky is here in Jeddah. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is here. There are meetings with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who is here in Jeddah. Whether Marco Rubio will see President Zelensky, you'd think they would. Clearly, Zelensky is the head of state, and Marco Rubio is the chief diplomat, so they might not traditionally see each other, but in the context of being with the Crown Prince, you can imagine how that might come about. What I do think is that it's unlikely we're going to hear very much about what is said, which it's going to be quite a contrast, isn't it, between what happened in the Oval Office with President Zelensky and President Trump, and perhaps you might say it's better that way. They can be straightforward and honest without it kind of exploding on camera. Tomorrow, the Ukrainian delegation and the US delegation, led by the Secretary of State, will meet. And look, I think it's going to be relatively fraught. I'm sure it'll be very diplomatic, but it's difficult because effectively there is a distance between the Ukrainian position and the Russian position. The two sides haven't fully set out their positions, certainly not the Russians in particular, but we can see that there's clearly a difference, and with the Americans too. So just an example of that, it appears that President Trump has agreed with the idea of European NATO allies putting peacekeeping troops on the ground in Ukraine. The Russians, through their foreign minister, have said they're absolutely opposed to that, even if it's not under the under a NATO umbrella. So there's a lot to be done. The big question, I think, for the Ukrainians is whether they can demonstrate that they do want to move towards a ceasefire. That's what the Trump administration is insisting that it wants to see, and whether they can get through these talks without them breaking down. Because if there is a problem here in Jeddah, then inevitably, I would say, that's going to lead to more pressure on Ukraine, on President Zelensky.
Keir Simmons, thank you so much for that. So, Courtney, the possibility of some troops, peacekeeping troops aside, you have other reporting on Trump's demands for Zelensky if he's going to restart aid and intel sharing with Ukraine. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we found out that it's not just the critical minerals deal that President Trump is interested in order to restart that critical flow of weapons and equipment and intelligence sharing with Ukraine that was paused as of last week, Chris. In fact, beyond the minerals deal, he's also looking for a change in overall attitude from President Volodymyr Zelensky, according to two officials familiar with President Trump's thinking on this. And he expects that President Zelensky will also change and make some concessions when it comes to ending this war and when it comes to some sort of a peace deal. And that could, Chris, even include giving up some land. Now, in addition to that, President Trump has also told his top aides, some of his closest aides, that he is looking for some sort of movement towards elections in Ukraine as a part of this. Maybe not necessarily Zelensky stepping down immediately, but some movement towards some sort of elections. Of course, that would be extremely difficult given the combat situation, the active war that's going on in Ukraine right now. But those are the conditions that President Trump has told his aides he wants before they will restore the weapons and the intelligence. And as far as the intelligence goes, Chris, we have also learned that, in fact, the U.S. is still sharing defensive information with Ukraine. So what that looks like is the U.S. believes that they still have a need to alert, or a right, Ukraine has a right of self-defense. The U.S. is providing information about, hey, look, it looks like Russia is preparing to attack, but they aren't providing the targeting information so Ukraine can hit back at Russia or even strike at Russia in advance. Of course, the U.S. has been providing targeting information as well as signals intelligence and other intelligence to Ukraine for the last 3+ years, Chris.
So, Mark, I'm starting to compile this list. Donald Trump wants a change in attitude. He wants elections. He's ruled out NATO membership for Ukraine. He says it's impossible for Kyiv to reclaim all the territory that Russia took. So give us your assessment of both these demands, but also where that sort of starts things off as we look into these negotiations.
Well, Chris, just look at the venue where we're meeting. It's in Saudi Arabia. So there's been a 10-year alliance we've had with the Ukrainians. There's been a lot of bilateral meetings in Washington and Kyiv. They're supposed to be, we're supposed to be allies. Why in the world are we meeting in a neutral third party? And the answer is because we've switched. We're now neutral at best and perhaps even tilting towards Moscow. And so I think just even the venue itself is very telling. But one of the things that I think people should really understand is the amount of trust that's been lost. When the U.S. pulled back on both military, sharing military equipment or provision of it, and then, of course, intelligence information, with the events that happened in Kursk over the last several days, Ukrainians died. And the Ukrainians know this. And so I think it's going to take a lot to kind of regain that level of trust between the two sides. Perhaps they're going to force Zelensky to sign some sort of performative, theatrical, raw minerals deal. But ultimately, what I think actually is going to happen is, because the Trump administration does not want to provide any security guarantees, the Ukrainians are going to be looking now to buy time, but looking to Europe to provide that. And so I know that there was just mention of European, troops on the ground. That's where really this has to go if there's any chance of a peace settlement.
You mentioned venues. So, look, I have to ask you, in the last couple of years, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has gone from essentially being a pariah to playing a central role in global diplomacy. So what does he bring to the table in these talks to end the war between Ukraine and Russia? Does he have any real role in all of this?
Well, in some sense, he's trusted by multiple sides. The Trump administration, of course, has had a very close relationship with the Saudis, with Mohammed bin Salman. We call him MBS. The Ukrainians as well are close to him. And of course, the Russians have had longstanding relationships. So in theory, it's not a bad place to meet if, for example, you're trying to act as a mediator. But again, why are we meeting with the Ukrainians, our ally, in a neutral venue? I think that's something that is pretty telling.
And Courtney, in this very uncertain world, you have some exclusive new reporting on some potential staffing cuts at the Pentagon. Tell us about it.
Yeah, as part of these ongoing efforts to make cuts in the Pentagon and across the Department of Defense, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is expected to announce at some point soon a new initiative that would include cutting as many as 10% of the general officer and flag officer billet. So basically what that means is to be a general or an admiral, you have to have a job that you're assigned to. They are now looking at cutting between 8 and 10%, so up to 10% of those jobs, those billets, which would mean that those generals and those admirals in those jobs would in many cases would probably retire, but there wouldn't be that pipeline for the younger officers to move up to. So right now the law says that the military can have as many as 857 total generals and admirals. That's 1-star up to 5-star, frankly, but at this point we only have 4-star. But total generals and admirals across the entire United States military. This would be cutting upwards of 10% of those, Chris.
Courtney Kube and Mark Polymeropoulos, thank you both.